Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Byron Sanders.
Class 6, how y'all feeling? Yo, I was sitting down there, I'm not crying, you crying. I'm not crying. Some allergies. Those were some powerful stories, y'all. That was amazing. I love Year Up. I do. I love Year Up for this reason. I love Year Up. And I wanted to go into why I love Year Up. First of all, thanks. Thanks for allowing me to come and share in this moment with you. This was a class that I came and spoke to earlier, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right. I remember. This is part 2. We got part 2. Thank you, Dr. Adames, for having the vision to embrace an organization like this, to provide one of the most transformational partnerships in our city and in North Texas. So again, thank you. Let's hear it again for the partnership here. King Good Games, thank you for answering the call and stepping in and leading this organization, and for the partnerships that we've already been able to build with Andres and with the whole team, the whole squad over here. This is a fantastic organization. Thank y'all. Thank you, young people, you, for taking a chance on yourself. Like, for real. Thank you. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But I want to tell you why I love Year Up. I'm going to tell you why I love Year Up by starting with a story about my son. So my son, his name is Bryce, and he is a ball of energy. He's a pinball. He's bouncing everywhere, off of everything. My son just hit double digits. He's 10 years old, and I don't know what to do with myself because that means that I am old. And I'm okay with that, cool. But one of the stories that I remember about Bryce, even as he's here today and he can't sit still, that stuff was very consistent when he was a child as well. But here's the thing. He would wake up every morning, and it didn't matter whether it was a weekday or a weekend. It didn't matter. My boy would wake up, this was about when he was 2 years old, and he would yell. And the thing that would frustrate me so much is that he would yell this: "I'm awake! I'm awake!" And I'm like, I know. It is self-evident right now, brother. Just chill for a bit. You know, I've had a long week. But it was interesting. You know, my son, I told you, he's a pinball. He's off the wall and everything, but still, he would wake up every morning and yell, "I'm awake." And he would be in a bed just doing that by himself. And what would happen is I would walk down the hall and I would go to his door. I'd knock on it and open it. You know, don't want to scare him because he's yelling, "I'm awake." I walk in there and I'm like, "Hey, buddy, how you doing?" It's like, "Great." You just look at me. I was like, "You want to get up?" And then he's up and bouncing around and doing his thing, putting together puzzles, building his Legos, playing with his dinosaurs, doing all of that stuff. But it's very interesting because there was no reason why he couldn't do that by himself in the first place, right? He's literally not tethered. We did not seat belt buckle our children to the beds. Like, he could just get up. But there's an interesting transition that he had only recently made. He had just come from something, a crib. So what's the difference between a crib and a bed? Bars, entrapment, limitations, right? And because my son, from birth to that moment, even when he wasn't, that is all he'd known, he thought that that was the limitation of his existence. The only reason The only way that he could get up if somebody came and got him. So even when those limitations, those bars didn't exist, the limitations did exist in his mind. And so it was so important that he had a daddy who would wake up every morning frustrated, got all the eye crusties still there. But I would walk down the hall, I would open the door, and the only thing that he needed to hear was, "Hey, buddy, you want to get up?" And he had that permission, the permission to be all that he already was inside. Let's be clear. You were always brilliant. You were always beautiful. You were always powerful. You have a really cool job right now, but that job doesn't define you. This career doesn't define you. Everything that you're doing right now, you're doing it because you were born great. And don't you ever forget that. Every place you walk into, every door you open, every place that you belong. And there's not a person there who exists in that room, who sits in that boardroom, who sits behind that desk, who is more deserving of you to be where you are. You were born great. And the reason why I love Year Up is because Year Up didn't make you better. Year Up didn't implant greatness inside of you. All Year Up did was create the conditions for you to see that inside of yourself. They gave you tools, they gave you skills, they gave you tips and tricks. They talked to you about, some tips of the trade and all of that stuff. With Jason, Jonathan, everybody else who's graduating and was walking across this stage, you already had what you needed to be the best you humanly possible. You are powerful. And the reason why it's so important that you recognize your power is a couple of reasons. One, for yourself. Now you have some tools where you can kind of channel that power that was already there toward your best life. You have a career, you have goals, you now believe that you belong. You have all of that in large part thanks to the conditions that have been created by Year Up and these partnerships, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs. You've never seen so many finance people play happily in the sand together than this program, right? Because banks are like gangs. They like, rep your clique. I'm with the Bank of, I'm kidding. They're not that bad. But it's so beautiful to see all of these institutions come together to create these opportunities. And you have these opportunities right now, right? So it's important for you personally to be able to embrace, engage, and chart your path. But here's the other reason why it's really important, and I'm going to talk to you about a couple of cautionary tales. Recently, in the Dallas Morning News, there have been a couple of stories over the past couple of months. One was about the last house on Harry Hines being torn down that was a remnant of Little Mexico. Little Mexico, we know today as Uptown. But that community existed and had a ton of history, a ton of love, a ton of assets, a ton of joy, a ton of brilliance that existed prior to what we now know today. But the last house from that community has been demolished. There's another community in Dallas that's going through their own struggle right now, 10th Street District. 10th Street District is another community here in Dallas, and it's a Friedmans Town. A Friedmans Town. What is that? That's a community that came up, many like it came up across the entire country post-Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, freed slaves all across the country because of segregation. They weren't allowed to live in a lot of other communities, so they decided to live together. They band together. They built these beautiful places. If anybody's heard of Black Wall Street, that was another Freedmen's community, and we have those here in Dallas. Self-contained, banks, libraries, transportation systems, movie theaters, thriving, entrepreneurship. But again, that community is in danger. It's on a list of most endangered historic communities in our country. Why? Well, the why is because resources. What happens is when there are communities that have been deprived of resources by intentional and unintentional means, those communities are at risk because they lack agency. You don't have homeowners existing in these communities. You have a lot of renters. And when you're a renter, the landlord gets to decide what happens with that property. So when someone says, hey, I'm coming to buy, the people who are living there oftentimes are voiceless on what happens with the only place that many of them have known as home. You've heard of the term gentrification, and that's evolving and reshaping communities all across our city, all across our nation. And people are lacking the power and the agency to be able to be the arbiters of their communities' thrive instead of demise. Well, how do you thwart that? How do you block that? Some of you all, you know the story that I'm talking about very well. Some of you might be living in those very communities. I know I grew up in communities in and adjacent to ones like I'm talking about right now. You know the best way to make sure that communities' culture, history is allowed to thrive? Is that people coming from them are empowered with resource, access, and agency. Guess how they do that? They go and get a degree. They go and get a certificate. They go and get a fantastic job in corporate America where they can start a 401k, where they can build into their own households economic viability. They can start to build wealth, and they can pass that wealth on to the next generation, to Jason's baby daughter. She will be able to be the recipient of the legacy of strength that he started to build through this very program. 20% of our net worth, studies show 20% of net worth and wealth comes from inheritance. An inheritance is a generational, multi-generational investment in ourselves. You all are starting that, just as a show of hands. How many of you all are either first generation higher education or first generation white collar job opportunity, corporate opportunity? How many hands? Look at that, everybody. The reason why this is possible is the same reason why you need to be channeling your power and your agency, not just to your own house and to your own household, but out into those communities. The people sitting around you are largely responsible for the journey that you have walked. I myself come from a two-parent household, but for the majority of my life, I wish that it was a single parent. I come from a house where there was domestic violence. I come from a house where, it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that the lights were going to be on by the time I got back. I come from a household that comes through strife. And matter of fact, I have been able to do well thanks to all of the people who poured into me, but I come from a household where there's a tale of two brothers. My brother's life looks very different from mine. But for a few people who crossed my path, I could have been dealing with a lot of the same things that he was dealing with. In dealing drugs, using drugs, he ended up having a mental breakdown and setting himself on fire. By the grace of God, he survived. You know what? He's come full circle, and he's about to get his degree coming through Dtriplec here at this institution. As a radiology technician. It's those people that we need to be thinking about as we take our next steps into our careers, into our pathways. It's those communities like 10th Street and like Little Mexico that we need to be thinking about as we're going out and living our best lives, because we're succeeding not just for ourselves, but just like my brother said earlier, we're succeeding so that we can climb and lift as we do. We're succeeding because we recognize that the inherent greatness that you were born with, your cousin was born with, your neighbor was born with, your peer was born with, some of the people who are incarcerated today were born with. There are so many people out there that have the same greatness and capacity to live for themselves the way that you're living for yourself right now inside of them. But the only difference was they didn't come across that thing that you thought was kind of fake because it sounded too good to be true, but that you signed up for, and it's created this opportunity for you here right now. They are just as great as you are, and they deserve as much opportunity as you have right now. And the only way we're going to do that is when we collectively take responsibility for our communities and creating those access to opportunities. That's how we build a better world. That's how we protect our communities. That's how we reinvest. And to quote my favorite commercial that's out right now, we come from humble beginnings, right? A lot of us come from humble beginnings. But the point isn't to create more superhero, Superman stories of the ones that made it out and the ones that got away. The point is for us to go out and create a world where there are no more humble beginnings. So with that said, I'll end with this. I challenge you all to come up with your purpose, to find your purpose, to figure out your mission statement last time. I don't know if any of you did, but I'll just remind you what mine is, just for the template. The mission of Byron Keith Sanders is to love my God with all my heart and soul, to be the husband, father, son, and brother according to what pleases him, to work diligently and daily in my most sincere efforts to pursue my appointed purpose with honor, character, bravery, and love. That's my mission. What's yours? And the hint, again, is that it always has something to do with somebody other than yourself. Go out there, change the world, and make it so we have no more humble beginnings. Thank you all so very much. Congratulations.